They thought they had power, papers, clipboards, rules printed in smug fonts, and fines that piled up like snow against a locked door. But the moment that first violation notice fluttered onto my porch, stamped with that ridiculous HOA seal, I knew they had no idea who they were dealing with. I'd lived on the edge of this development for over 15 years, long before the HOA ever existed, long before the streets were paved or the cookie cutter hoe. Witherspoon, the self-declared president and self-important tyrant, started strutting through the neighborhood in her golf cart, clipboard in hand like some suburban Napoleon. My land was old, deep-rooted, and most importantly, it came with something none of them bothered to research: the deed to the only road leading in and out of their pristine little gated kingdom, a road I had paid to maintain for over a decade, patched after monsoons, classed after monsoons, classed and third monsoons, after monsoons, classed. The county had long ago relinquished to private ownership, which I quietly assumed when the previous owner sold it off to fund his relocation to Arizona. So when I received that first $500 violation for having non-compliant fencing that had been there before the HOA was even formed, I laughed, tossed it in the fireplace, and poured myself a drink. Then came the $2,000 fine for unapproved modifications, so $5,000 for refusing to attend their mandatory compliance review meeting, which I also ignored, mostly because I had no intention of dignifying their kangaroo court of nosy neighbors and retired power-drunk bureaucrats, all led by Karen, who was clearly enjoying her little dictatorship a little too much. It didn't stop there. Fines stacked weekly, then daily, each more absurd than the last. $1,200 for now, from $1,200 for now, $1,200 for Nenefuril. $1,200 for $1,200 for $1,200 for no. From their nearest lot. $800 for unauthorized signage when I put up a no trespassing sign, and finally the $70,000 cumulative noncompliance penalty delivered by some trembling teenager they hired to post notices door to door. When I opened the envelope, thick with condescension and legal fluff, I didn't get mad. I smiled, because that was the moment I knew they'd pushed too far, and it was time to remind they'd pushed too far, and it was time to remind off the file I've been keeping for just this kind of moment, and handed over the original deed, title, and maintenance receipts for the only road that served as ingress and egress for the entire HOA-controlled neighborhood. He nearly choked on his coffee when he saw it. "You mean they've been fining you while driving over your road every day?" he asked, and I nodded. "Good," he said, "because this is going to be fun." Within 48 hours, immediately, all HOA access to the road was revoked due to unpaid toll usage, land encroachment, and failure to establish a right-of-way agreement. It was posted at both ends of the road, and I installed heavy-duty, padlocked steel gates with cameras, motion detectors, and floodlights. Not because I wanted to trap anyone, but because I wanted to make a point: ownership matters, and ignorance is no defense. The neighborhood exploded in keyed BS. Buses, Instacart drivers turned around at the gates, and emergency services refused to respond without a verified right-of-way. Karen showed up at my gate within hours, fuming, waving her clipboard like it was the Constitution, demanding I cease unlawful obstruction. But I didn't even bother opening the gate. I just spoke through the intercom, calmly explaining that she and the HOA had 48 hours to pay back toll usage and plus retroactive legal fees and interest. She threatened to call the police. I told her to go right ahead, and she did. When they arrived, I showed them the deed, the county assessor's records, and a signed letter from the county itself confirming my private ownership of the road. The officers left 5 minutes later, shaking their heads and muttering something about idiots with clipboards. The next HOA board meeting was moved to Zoom because the county assessor's records. Their emergency motion to take control of the road was laughed out of the local planning commission, who ruled in my favor within a week, stating that no HOA could retroactively seize property not included in their original charter, especially not a road that predated their formation. As the fines evaporated into legal irrelevance, I sent my own invoices: $125,000 for unlicensed road use, $18,000 for unlicensed road use, $18,000. Those who had always been friendly approached me directly, and I gave them individual access codes for a modest $10 per month maintenance fee, which they gladly paid. Others, like Karen and her inner circle of petty tyrants, refused, and I watched with a certain satisfaction as they parked their luxury SUVs at the nearby gas station and walked half a mile in the heat to reach their perfectly manicured homes. Karen tried filing a loss immediately, citing over a decade of clear, uncontested ownership on my part, and even slapped her with sanctions for abusing the court's time. Eventually, the HOA folded, public backlash grew, homeowners revolted, and Karen was voted out in disgrace. A new board was elected, more reasonable, more respectful, and one of their first acts was to offer a formal apology and a proper easement agreement at fair market value. Whoper easement agreement at fair market value. Public backlash grew. Used the proceeds to finally build that cabin expansion I'd been dreaming about. From my porch, I can still see the gate, standing firm, a monument to arrogance, a reminder that power isn't in the paper or the fines, it's in the dirt under your feet, and the quiet records most people never bother to read. And in knowing that when you're standing on your own land, you don't need permission, you just need patience and the right timing. With the gates standing like sentinels at the edge of my property, the fallout from my decision rippled far beyond just the HOA board. Local news caught wind of the standoff within a week, and the headline practically wrote itself. Man blocks HOA after $70,000 fine, reveals he owns only access road. I didn't even need to talk to reporters. Drone shots of the padlocked steel gates and the long line of luxury SUVs parked helplessly outside the community said more than I ever could. Still, I granted one exclusive interview to a local investigative journalist who had covered HOA abuse stories before, and I laid out every fine, every violation notice, and every document proving ownership of the road. Her coverage was brutal. On ISIS. Once blindly followed, HOA directives began showing up on my property, not to protest, but to apologize, to bring baked goods, to offer assistance, and in one case, to hand me a check for $1,000 to cover back tolls out of sheer embarrassment for having supported Karen's crusade. Even the local sheriff stopped by, not to interfere, but to tell me privately that he was glad someone was finally putting that HOA patterns. Karen, however, didn't back down easily. Despite her ousting, she began making noise about forming a resistance group and publicly claimed that the road was a public necessity and therefore could be claimed under eminent domain, a move that would require the city council's involvement, but even they laughed her out of chambers when she proposed it, since no infrastructure funds or public maintenance had ever been allocated to structure funds or public maintenance had ever been allocated to the Dr. Name and movie to mean that the road be required being allocated to even then in there. When the HOA was formed legally, politically, and socially, she was cornered. But like all narcissists stripped of power, she turned vicious. I woke up one morning to find my mailbox smashed in, tire tracks across my front lawn, and a handwritten note stuffed under my door that read, "You'll regret this." My cameras had caught it all. Karen, wearing a hoodie and gloves at 3:12 a.m., wielding a metal bat like she was in some low-budget revenge movie. I reported her, of course, but instead of pressing charges immediately, I played it differently. I had my lawyer file for a temporary restraining order served to her while she was at a garden club meeting. That, paired with the footage, was enough to bar her from even being within 500 feet of my property or the road itself. With her legally kept away and publicly humiliated, the new HOA board got to work. They were composed mostly of younger professionals and longtime residents who had grown weary of Karen's nonsense and saw this crisis as a turning point. They invited me to a formal board meeting, not in the clubhouse, which no one could reach anymore, but in the town library, and they didn't come to argue. They came to make a deal. Their offer? A long-term easement agreement that included a monthly maintenance stipend, full legal recognition of my property boundaries, and the complete nullification of every past fine, fee, and citation effective immediately. I reviewed the proposal, smiled, and added one clause of my own. Any future HOA board member must complete a legal seminar on private property rights within 90 days of taking office. They agreed without protest. I signed the easement, provided them with electronic gate codes for every household that agreed to the new toll-sharing program, and lifted the blockade that had held for over 2 months. The community was breathing again. Commuters rolled past the gate, children got back on their buses, food delivery resumed, and the clubhouse finally reopened, but things weren't the same. For the first time in years, people questioned the HOA's power. Residents began reading bylaws, challenging fee structures, attending meetings in record numbers, and voting on every decision. The tyrannical HOA culture had been broken not by lawsuits or protests, but by one man with a gate and a deed. As for Karen, she faded into obscurity, moved out quietly one night, a foreclosure sign replacing her expensive landscaping just 2 weeks later. Rumor had it she'd defaulted on her HOA dues during her resistance, and the board, now under legitimate leadership, had no interest in protecting her. In the end, justice wasn't loud. It was precise, and it was permanent. I took the easement payout and invested it into expanding the road, not because they asked, but because I wanted to. I paved it cleaner, added better drainage, installed LED solar lights, and built a roadside pullout for deliveries and emergency services. They now depended on the road, but they also respected it, and that was all I ever wanted. Not power, not money, just respect, and the space to live without being fined for repainting a barn or fixing a fence. Occasionally, I still get the urge to drive down the street and see what they're up to, if the lawns are trimmed, if the clubhouse still echoes with polite meetings instead of petty tyranny. And sometimes when I pull up to the gate and see someone new struggling with the keypad, I step out, help them punch in the code, and smile. Because they always ask, "Are you the guy who blocked the whole neighborhood?" And I always answer the same way, "No, I'm the guy who reminded them who owns the road."